404, this is 7, stand by a minute. Just come on, what is your attack angle?
Okay, talk to him, see what that did. Charlie Horse, San Diego.
24, traffic 275.
65 just made a pass in there. Can you give us any?
Go to 21, 77.
Roger, sir. Be advised we have Jolly Green 21 and 66 standing by.
Good afternoon. Another beautiful day in paradise. You know, I was thinking, I said, you know, what do you do when you're with people that's older than you are, younger than you are, and just in all different shapes and forms and fashions, you know? And I thought about it, and I said, you know, maybe I'll just wake them up a little bit. I said, I stopped by McDonald's not too long ago, and I was standing there, and this elderly couple came in. He set his wife down, and he went over and got in line, and he ordered a quarter-pounder value meal. And the guy behind him noticed and said he'd only bought one meal. So he asked, "Sir, can I buy you another meal?" He said, "No." Said, "No, my wife and I, we share everything." And so anyway, he got the meal and went over there, and the guy came over again and said, "Sir, I sure would like to buy you and your wife an extra meal, even if you just take it home." He said, "No, we're fine. We share everything." So the gentleman sat there, he got 2 straws and put in the drink, you know, and he sat down in the middle of the table for him and his wife. And then he sat there and counted out the French fries. And then he took a knife and he cut the hamburger in half. Next thing you know, they said a little prayer, and he just folded his arms and was sitting there. And he said, "Sir, can I buy you a meal?" He said, "No." He said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm fine." He says, "Why aren't you eating?" He said, "I'm waiting for his teeth." But we share everything. But, no, a lot of times when I speak, I try to bring up some of the titles of the books that have been written by other prisoners of war. But as I look out at this group and talked with you and read some of the stories in the books that Tom had given me, I realized they could have been titles to the books that you could have written, called "When Hell Was in Session," "Surviving Hell," "Chained Eagles," "In the Presence of My Enemy." They wouldn't let me die. "The Long Road Home." Every one of them could have been written there, and it could have been your story of what you did for your nation. You know, I like to step back in time a little bit. I grew up in, like you mentioned, it was a little cotton mill town in eastern North Carolina, 6 miles south of Virginia border on I-95. I'm sure many of you passed through it and never even noticed it, but it is written on the billboard, Roanoke Rapids. And, you know, we're of the age that we didn't have all the fancy monuments that we now have in Washington, D.C. and some of the state capitals. Every little community honored their own. And in the cotton mill where I lived, you know, at each one of the cotton mills, they had a plexiglass wall, and behind it was just name after name after name, with an American flag behind it to represent those who had served. My grandfather took me to that wall when I was just a youngster, not knowing exactly what it was, but I stood there and I looked at it, and all I could see was name after name after name. Finally, my grandfather broke the silence and told me what that wall was about. He said, when our country came under attack in World War II, these are the people in our community that raised their right hand and said, "Take me. I want to defend America." We all worry at some time today as to whether we have those kind of people today that would stand up and say, "Take me. I want to defend America." As we looked at the names, my father's name, my uncle's name, some of my senior cousins, and people that I had grew up around, the guys that got up every morning and went to the cotton mill, I never knew that they had donned the uniform of this great nation. I had an old friend there that I'd talked with for years and walked with to and from the mill at certain times, and he had a limp. I never bothered to ask him what that limp was all about. It was a Purple Heart that he had gotten in battles in World War II. We talked about different ones on there, and as we were discussing this one, all of a sudden, the non-high school graduates, he said so-and-so there, he lied about his age so he could go into service, And so, as we were looking at the wall, I noticed that some of the names had stars beside them. Finally, I asked my grandfather, I says, what does that star stand for? Kind of with a lump in his throat and a tear in his eyes, he said, they're the ones that made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms that we enjoy every day. We fast forward to my generation, paying homage to our brothers and sisters who bravely fought in what is referred to so many times as a forgotten war, sometimes referred to Korea. Those brave ones did their part for the defense of our nation and our allies. We have a wall with over 58,000 stars on it to honor our generation. We say it real fast and it don't sound bad, but it was, we killed that many every year in car accidents. Fentanyl have taken more. But these were our brothers and sisters that gave their all for this nation. The saddest part, when you look at it, it's breezed over by news media and everything else. But on that wall, 39,000 were 22 years of age or younger. 36,000 were 19 years of age or younger. Many like you here in this audience. We hear now at this time of the year, we hear all our seniors discussing their senior trip. They don't realize how many of us, our senior trip was to Vietnam. We have over 7 million stories. Over 7 million families had their life altered for life as a result of loss of a loved one or one that's injured in battle. But these were the sons and daughters of this nation. I, like you, experienced the same thing, and the first thing I learned when I joined the military was the recruiters, weathermen, politicians, and used car salesmen had all graduated from the same school. They sent me to Lackland Air Force Base with one change in the underwear and found out that the Air Force was on a 4-day break. So you might say we were a smelly bunch. Of course, I had a size advantage, so the TI thought I needed additional exercise, so he made me a road guard so I could get that additional exercise. And I had a friend from South Carolina, and his eyes were a little offset, so they made him a road guard because they were convinced he could see in 2 directions at once. After completing part of the basic training at Lackland, I moved on to Shepherd Air Force Base and completed the second part of my training and going to helicopter maintenance school. And when I was surrounded by these guys, both civilian and military, I said, now, don't compare this to the real Air Force. This is the training. So once you get through this, you'll get the new Air Force. Next thing they came down wanted us to fill out what I call a dream sheet. So I filled out the dream sheet, thinking I'd get what I wanted. And my brother-in-law had come back from Alaska, and I thought that would be a great frontier, to start out with. So when the assignments came down, 3 of my classmates went to Alaska, and I went to Altus, Oklahoma. And so I knew that the Air Force and I were on the same frequency at that point. And, of course, I just headed out from Shepherd, and it really felt kind of strange. I went only about 35 miles, and I had to change buses. And when I went out to the bus, they said, leaving from Gate 7, headed north to Altus, Oklahoma, Mainland, Oklahoma, ended up in Norman, Oklahoma, So I go out there looking for a great big trailway bus. I all I saw was a car sitting there. It was an 8-passenger 1958 Chevrolet with Trailway written on the side of it. I thought to myself, where in the hell am I going? They can't even afford to send a bus up there. You got to send a little bitty old car. But I arrived at Altus, and Altus at that time was a SAC base, which is heavy bomber. And I was part of the helicopter maintenance crew. But if you want to get on the bottom of the totem pole, be a helicopter crew chief assigned to a B-52 wing supporting Atlas missiles. You know, when you're talking about getting less than nothing, we did a good job of getting less than nothing. And of course, I was prepared, you know, and in briefing, they said, says, once you get in SAC owns you. They don't give you up easily. Well, I thought that I'd be there for the rest of my Air Force career, which would be 4 to 20 years. Didn't know what at that particular point. A year later, I had an assignment to Korea. I went in there and said, wait a minute, where am I going? They said, well, you're just not needed here. We're looking for B-52 crew chief, not helicopter crew chief. So, but one thing is I prepared to process out going to a foreign base, a foreign country. Stood there as a 19-year-old. The old crusty staff sergeant called me in. He looked me square in the face and said, Airman, there's a few things I need to tell you. He said, you're going overseas for the first time. He said, I want you to know that you represent yourself, you represent your family, you represent the United States Air Force, but most of all, you represent the United States of America and act accordingly. To this day, I wish Jane Fonda had gotten that briefing. Yeah. When I got to Korea and went through the process there, and next thing you know, they put another one of the dream sheets in front of me, and it's a little bit more sophisticated, you might say. I just got a magic marker and wrote Anywhere USA on it and headed back in. And I found out that will get you a trip to the chief's office pretty quick. So next thing I know, I'm standing before the chief, and we were discussing. He said, you're coming back off a remote tour. You got a 75% chance of getting the base you want. You got an 85% chance of getting the area you want. And then you got a 95% chance of getting the state you want, And so with his careful hand and guidance, I filled out my dream sheet. Meantime, he rotated back to the States, and my assignment came down. Of course, I'd picked out Seymour Johnson as my base of choice in North Carolina, and I'd picked out the Southeast, and I'd picked out Florida as my state of choice because at that time they had 30 little rescue detachments thrown out all over Florida. So I felt real good about my vibes, So when my assignment came down, it was Grand Forks, North Dakota. So I realized what Will Rogers had said in 1934. There's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. When I got to Grand Forks, they said, oh, by the way, did you get the word? I said, what's the word? They said, well, our detachment is closing. You'd like to know where you'd like to go from here. But I'd reached a 3-year point in my Air Force career, and I said, hell, I think I'll just go to the house. This ain't working out, And next thing I know, this thing called Indochina, Southeast Asia, you notice we never referred to it as Vietnam until much later. And I started recollecting the last 3 years. Was I prepared for what was holding in the future? I came on active duty, like I said, in late 61. In mid-62, when I first arrived at my first base, I was surrounded by the World War II and the Korean War veterans who were been there, done that, and had a T-shirt. And I listened to them talk about the Bay of Pigs, talk about the incident in 1961, what a fiasco it was simply because of communication. We couldn't talk to each other. Couldn't Air Force couldn't talk to the Army. Army couldn't talk to the Navy. Nobody could communicate. It was just everybody had their own secret little thing. And as a result of that, the Bay of Pigs of '61 goes down in the list of failures. The only thing of pride that came out that stands tall to me today is Kennedy was the president, and he took full responsibility for what had happened. We know he didn't do the planning, he didn't do anything, but he was in charge at the time it happened. And that's what leadership is all about. You take responsibility and you move on and do better. As a result of that, I was at Altus when the Cuban Missile Crisis, and next thing you know, we discovered nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba. And within 72 hours, those boxes were being repacked and shipped back to Leicester because we had our act together, and the thing was moving forward, and like I said, I never saw anything as serious as I saw in 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we had it together. In fact, we jokingly say we thought we was going to have to put pontoons around Florida because we had so many airplanes down there. We were afraid we were going to sink the whole island, the peninsula. But in a short period of time, we were back to a no back. I was in Korea when our president was assassinated. Again, you're sitting there as a 20-year-old and you're saying, my God, what's next? But I was surrounded by those real heroes of World War II in Korea that says, stay cool, we'll get through this. Let's let it play out before we get all excited. And it was kind of a smoothing thing to have leadership around it that they kept you in check. And we did. And then I started thinking about my new adventure. And I realized that things had been going on for a while. I remember when I was at Altus, guys would disappear, and they'd come back a few months later, and you asked them where they'd been, and the answer was, I'd been out crop dusting. Even when I was in Korea, guys would just disappear, and the next thing you know, they asked them when they come back, where you been? All you'd ever get out of them was been crop dusting. And even the short time I'd been in North Dakota. So I guess you might say that it was my turn to go crop dusting. You might say that 60 years ago today, I was like a cat on a hot tin roof because I was leaving at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning 60 years ago, heading to Southeast Asia. And, I wasn't sure what I was getting into because everything at that time was classified. You'll know when you get there. There's somebody will brief you along the way or whatever. And I left Grand Forks on the 25th of April, 1965. It was 24 degrees on the flight line. 3 days later, I arrived in Bangkok, Thailand. It was 108 degrees and I was wearing the winter blues. So, I was about to melt at that point, And then we moved on up to what we now known as non-comp and non-TAL land. And we were briefed on what we were doing. We had created a rescue group. Up to that point, basically after the Korean War, the military said, oh, we don't need rescue anymore. We'll just figure it out as we go, and next thing of a sudden, we're all standing there, and now all of a sudden we need rescue. And so we looked at what we had. We have what we call an LBR airplane, stood for Local Base Rescue. Basically, some of you guys remember back in yesteryears, you see an airplane crash, and then next thing you know, a helicopter would show up, and they have a little fire bottle hanging underneath the airplane. They take the fire bottle in, set it down, back off, put 2 firemen on the ground, and go in there and rescue the pilots. And that was what the airplane we had. But it was the only thing we had. And of course, all of you know that anytime you get responsibility, you don't necessarily have the equipment to do the job. You make what you have work. So we we took this non-combat airplane and we made it into a combat airplane, with a piece of quarter-inch steel underneath the pilot and the co-pilot seat, and we sat on a World War II flak vest in the back, and we were ready to go to war. Because that's what our country asked us to do. We realized shortly that we didn't have the fuel range to do the job, so a group of NCOs put their heads together, and next thing you know, we come up with the first in-flight refueling on helicopters. And it was nothing well but two 55-gallon barrel, two cook connections, and a garden hose. But that's what we needed, and so, by God, there was nobody else to change. And the pilot thought it's the one thing you don't have too much of, and that's gas. And so that's the way we flew. And if we needed more fuel, we'd just add another barrel. We could store 3 barrels of GP4 in the back of the airplane. And one of my jobs as a crew chief was, once we burn off fuel, is to cook up the quick disconnects and the garden hose and drain the fuel into the tank. And once we done that, we just retrieved the quick disconnects and the garden hose. And in Air Force unofficial history, I get credit for 2 bombing runs over North Vietnam with a 55-gallon barrel. We were excited, and we were there for a 3-month TEY. And we come up in July, and we were ready to go home, and we earned a couple of medals, and we said, well, we'll go back and everything will be fine. The next thing you know, they brought in what now we know is a Jolly Green Giant. Unfortunately, it was a new airplane. It had issues that had to be dealt with. And the Air Force thought they had bought the perfect airplane and had not made any arrangements for the replacement of the 43 crew. This was our replacement. We were excited. We helped them get the airplanes together and get them flying. And then they started having mechanical issues. The Air Force solution was to extend us for the duration. And on the 20th of September 1965, I was shot down on a rescue mission over North Vietnam, which began on a simple day. The problem was that we had very little leadership, essentially, between the White House and the workers. Nobody could make a decision in the field. It had to be radioed in. And essentially, in 1965, most of the information was being guarded by the White House, and nobody would do anything without the White House approval. The rules of engagement were very complicated. First of all, the guy would get shot down, and then they wouldn't allow us to go airborne, but they would sit there, and we sat there for 2.5 hours on the ground waiting for them to locate the pilot and verify, was he American or not, because the biggest fear was that the airplane crashed, that the radio might fall in the wrong hands. They might find a perfect English-speaking Vietnamese that would draw American forces into an attack. And so this was kind of the thought process. We finally did get the go signal, and we were off and running, you might say. We got into the area, and of course, for us, we had a light overcast, and so we stayed above the clouds until we got in the area, and then we homed in on his beeper, and we were right over top of him, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. The A-1Es that were escorting us, they took a hit in the rocket pod, and the last transmission I heard over radio was unauthorized disposal of the ordnance in the local area. That's unheard of. When you would have thought that a good pilot would have had radio problems and never abandoned another one in battle. But the courtesy of the White House guidance crew, they were unauthorized disposal of the ordnance, and they gave them coordinates to go to a safe spot over the ocean and drop the ordnance. And by the time they got back, we were been shot down. They were kind of holding supply until they realized that once the A-1s rolled off, then, like I said, they opened fire on us. Fortunately for us, we were on the side of a hill, and so they were shooting down at us rather than up. And that's what saved our life, because if they'd been shooting up at us, it would have, there was nothing below us to protect us. Above us was the engines, the rotor blades, the transmission, and everything, and they took all the hits. And when they took a hit in the fuel control, the airplane spittered and sputtered, and the next thing we know, we were chopping bamboo. And I'm here to report that the blades for an HH-43 are no match for bamboo. And we fell. My responsibility as a hoist operator, I'm holding cable. We have 100 feet of cable, and I'm holding red cable. That meant I had everything the airplane had to offer at that time. And so we, as I was swinging the cable over to her, and at the same time we got a hit. The pilot was going by my directions, and the co-pilot and the flight medic was in board, was trying to fight off anybody. We don't know what they were shooting at that time, but we know that they were shooting at something. And once we took control, and like I said, we fell on the ground floor. The pilot we were trying to rescue came up and told us the place was infested, and we need to get the hell out of here. Of course, the rules of engagement was if you got shot down, you need to get out of the area as quickly as possible, because they're going to send a group in there to blow the airplane up so there's no aboard the airplane. We're falling in enemy hand. So we gathered what we had. Unfortunately, as most of you know, we were very ill-equipped. We had, by 68, the pilots were carrying 4 different radios. We had one radio for 4 people. We had one flare gun for 4 people. We just did not have the equipment that we needed to do the job. And like I said, in our World War II flak vest. But that was not our concern. Our concern was our brothers in harm's way. We found a hiding place. We got about a half a mile from the airplane and escaped and evaded, which we thought we went through. And it was very quiet for a few minutes, and then all of a sudden we started hearing more voices. They seemed to be getting louder, and seemed to be more of them as they were beating the bushes for us. And as we had hopes of staying in hiding, and in nightfall we would get out of the area and hopefully be rescued the next day. That was the goal at that particular time. But eventually, the voices were such budging, and next thing you know, the Vietnamese identified, they knew where we were. And I can remember my pilot looking at myself and Airman Black and said, "Live to fight another day." We didn't carry any weaponry, you might say. We had a 6-shooter. And like I said, when you're looking at 150 people with everything from machetes to machine guns, it's not a fair fight, and rather than just get ourselves killed, we chose to fight another day. You might say in a short period of time we were shot down. I survived the plane crash, and then eventually was captured. And didn't know what the next move would be. Once we were taken into captivity, we were marched down to the hamlets at the bottom of the hill in the mountainside. And at first, the Vietnamese were just treating us like a prize trophy. They had, first of all, most of them had never seen somebody that was 50 pounds heavier and a foot taller, so we weren't able to blend in the neighborhood, you might say. But at first, they were concerned about our health and well-being and continued to ask us questions in broken English, you might say. But then all of a sudden, the blowhorn showed up, and those people that wanted to speak to you now wanted to beat the hell out of you. And we just became targets, you might say. And next thing you know, the guards were trying to get us out of this area and get us back to safety. They were getting hit just as hard as we were, just because they were trying to protect us. The Vietnamese created that 2 or 3 different times during the next couple of days, just putting us on public display like a prize trophy, and then all things, and then bring in the blowhorn, and everything would just erupt from that point. I think, and I think about those days. I think about one morning, some mid-morning, probably about 10:30, 11 o'clock. I'm in a little makeshift cell. My feet are tied together at my ankles, and we had just enough movement that we could probably move a foot at the time, and we were really referred to as a Hanoi shuffle because we just shuffled from one place to another. Our hands were tied together at the wrists and elbows. We were blindfolded, and next thing I know, the guards came out, and one on each arm, that lifted me up from that makeshift cell and took me out. And as I was going out, I leaned back and I see that a crowd had gathered. And next thing you know, they stopped, and I'm looking down at a freshly dug grave. At that point, I knew that my life was over. I just wondered if my remains would ever return home. All sorts of thought process goes through your mind at that particular point. You're almost on the edge of all hope is lost, especially when he started speaking. And, I could sit there and imagine, even though it was in Vietnamese, that he was pleading my case, finding what they wanted to find, and now I was going to be executed just because I was an American. Next thing I know, something changed, and two guards behind me, I could see from the shadow that portrayed from behind me that they had their weapons pointed at the back of my head. They lowered their weapons, and one under each armpit lifted me back up and took me to my makeshift cell. I honestly feel at that time I had experienced a miracle. That from that point on, I knew I was going to survive. I didn't know what lied ahead of me, but I believe that the good Lord had sent me a message that I got other things for you to do. And these are one of the things that, the reason we're all here today is because God's grace was on us, and He's told us, each one of us, He has something else for us to do. Eventually, I was turned over to the regular military, and in kind of a no-nonsense atmosphere, I was transported north to Hanoi, which was the capital of North Vietnam. Along the way, we were again put on static display. We experienced a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I've always been thankful for fighter pilots as not a very good shot, because the rules of engagement were, and I can't explain this one, but anyway, if you saw a truck going along the road, you could shoot at it. But if you'd pulled off the side of the road, you couldn't. That was kind of the rules of engagements coming from Washington. Well, they didn't tell the Vietnamese drivers, because once they got jumped by a couple of fighters, rather than pull off the side of the road, they just stopped the truck and jumped out and left us sitting in the middle of the road, and the three of us in the back of the truck. And thank God they didn't have a good enough training. They scraped the truck 3 different times and missed it all 3 times. So I knew they had interventions at that point. Eventually, because they run out of bullets, I guess they went back home, and the drivers got back in. I'm sure they had changed their underwear, but anyway, we did, and then we continued on our trip, and ended up in a car accident, because like I said, some of them, I guess, they knew the rules, and what they would try to do if they come under fire, they would try to pull underneath a tree somewhere and hide. And while we were doing this late in the evening, and while we were in hiding, next thing you know, somebody plowed into the back of us. And so we got out of that accident pretty close. Probably one of the other experiences that wasn't really a lot of fun was you're laying in the bottom of a boat with your feet tied together, your hands tied together, blindfolded, crossing a river. And, you know, it kind of brings you the story about the Texan. You know, they were talking about went to a bar and they said everything is big in Texas. You know, so anyway, the guy had a few drinks. He asked the guy said, "Hey," he said, "where's the bathroom?" He said, "You go down the hallway and you turn right." Well, in his drunken stupor, he went down the hallway and turned left and fell into the swimming pool. And all I could hear was him screaming, "Don't flush it, don't flush it." And that's kind of the way we felt in the back of that boat. Don't roll it over, don't roll it over, you know. So, but anyway, we traveled on into Hanoi, and we got about a block from what we now know as the Hanoi Hilton, and we were, the guard pulled off our blindfold, and we could see what we referred to as the Hanoi Hilton. There were 25-foot high walls with a broken glass and concertina wire on the top. And I heard him say the word home. Of course, home to us, and I think it was probably in your day, was San Francisco. We always said, well, if I can get to San Francisco, if the government can get me that far, I can find my way home from there. And that's kind of the way we were. But and unfortunately, their thinking and my thinking was about 12,000 miles apart. And one thing, we pulled up to the door and they opened the door and we went through and we were shut in between the walls, you might say, and then they opened the second set of doors and we walked through. As we stood there wondering what the next event was, I was standing there with my pilot, the guy we were trying to rescue, and the other enlisted guy. And the Vietnamese took my pilot and the Will Forby, the guy we were trying to rescue, away. And I didn't see him again for 7 years. We went in different directions. To get you up to date, we lost our co-pilot. Once we were shot down, we got separated, and fortunate for him at that particular time, they weren't aware there was an additional person, so they concentrated on us, and he was able to slip through enemy lines, you might say, and he made it back into Laos and was captured in Laos. And he spent about 2 years in captivity in Laos, and then they learned us, or were more led to believe that they were going to kill all the prisoners of war. And so they all escaped. They managed to create an escape. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Rescue Dawn, but it was a movie about Dingler. Dingler was a survival specialist, a Navy pilot, and anyway, Martin was with him, and they were out for about a week, and they run out of food, water, and everything, and they were looking for things, and Martin, my co-pilot, went into the village looking for food and water, and he was jumped by one of the villagers, and he was killed at that point. And we are still trying to bring his remains home. So, you know, you think about decisions. You know, I could have been with Martin. My name could have been right beside his on Panel 2 East, Line 91. But fortunate, that was not to be at that time. Once I was by one of the guards, and I went through a maze of hallways, and then I ended up in the back corner, which I learned later we call New Guy Village. I was put in a small cell that was probably 6 to 7 feet. I could only, just looking at the door, I could stretch my arms and touch the wall, and I not quite touch it from door to the back wall. There was a bed in it. It was about 16 inches wide and about 4.5 feet long with a bow bucket at the end for your accommodations. And this was my first introduction to the Hanoi Hilton in North Vietnam. Fortunate for us, the Vietnamese wore flip-flops, just a form of sandal, and we could hear them coming and going through the hallways, and no more had the sound of those flip-flops removed from the area, a voice ranging out, identifying himself as Colonel Robinson Reisner, the senior ranking prisoner of war at that time. And his first words to me as a 22-year-old, just 25 days past my 22nd birthday, he said, "Be prepared to die for your country." As a normal 22-year-old, there was a lot of other things I could think about I should be doing, and this was not one of the things on my list. And but I understood what he was saying. We were interrupted several different times before he finally got all his messages to me. And one of the messages was, if we survive, we must return home with honor. And then he said, learn the tap code. In the book, some of you have written a part of mine that it describes the tap code. Basically, all we did, we took the alphabet, dropped a K, and used a C in the case of in place of a K. And it was from top to bottom, left to right. So if you wanted to send a C, for instance, you tap one time to identify the first row from the top to bottom, and then 3 taps would identify the third letter on that row. Z would essentially be 5 taps to get you down to the 5th row, and then 5 more taps to get you to the 5th letter on that row. And so that's the way we communicated. You could see where that was much better than the long form. The long form was 1 tap was A and 26 taps was Z. So it took a while to get a message across at that particular point. Many of us got very good at it, and the Vietnamese in the 7+ years were never able to break that simple code. Because thank God that fighter pilots can't spell, don't have good English, and use a lot of slang. And so, plus, whenever we were tapping, it's just kind of like nowadays when you type something on your computer, it tells you what's the next good word, and so once you identified where you were going, they would just go give you 2 taps and you move on. So you were doing a lot of incomplete sentences, you might say, but we knew the message. In the beginning, we were all convinced it was going to be a short war, and the most important thing for us to know who was there, and so that we would have a list that we could turn over to somebody so we could have a full accounting of everyone there. And this was our goal from day one, to make sure that we all came home and came home together. As I sat there in that cell, next thing you know, open that little door that's in the middle of the little small trap door, and I threw in a short shirt, a long shirt, or short pair of pants, a long pair of pants, much like pajamas or a drawstring, a bar of soap, a tube of toothpaste, a toothbrush, a hand towel, a mosquito net, a blanket, and a metal cup. Little did I know, when I looked at those things sitting on my bed, they would be my worldly possessions for the next 8 Thanksgivings, 8 Christmases, and 8 New Years that I would ring in captivity. When I think about food, I jokingly say we ate Oriental style. And somebody said, "What's that?" I said, that's a bowl of rice for breakfast, a glass of water for lunch, and swell up for supper. But in reality, we ate the vegetable of the season, and I'm here to report the grass grows year-round in Vietnam. We figured out we ate about 117 different varieties of grass. The Vietnamese had fancy names for it, and we did too. They said, "What did you call this in America?" They said, "We call it grass." And then they bring in something else that's, what do you call this in America? We call that sewerweed, And so we had our own American name for it. Meat was pretty non-existent during that period of time. If you got a piece of meat, it was about the size of a pinky. Or at best described, if you took a 2-pound chicken and cut it up and fed it to 87 people, you know what your fair share would be. And so, but we did get 2 special meals a year. They fed us a special meal at Christmas and then New Year. You know, and I think about that as over the years, if I've watched as these do-gooders keep rising up and saying, you know, we need to abandon Christmas. You know, even in a communist country, they didn't abandon Christmas. They allowed us. They even brought Bibles in for a day, you might say, so we could read a little bit of scripture. And that special meal might consist of a larger piece of meat, something sweet, like a piece of sweet bread. The most important thing was probably a cup of coffee. So we got a cup of coffee just about twice a year for the first few years. One year they brought in gave us a half a bottle of beer. You know, it wasn't the 33, the Bok, I guess you call it in South Vietnam. But anyway, you know, we didn't know what to do. So at that time, there's maybe 3 or 4 guys in the room, and they'd raffle off the beer. So they said, none of us are going to get high on half a bottle, so somebody might get high on 2. so we could watch each other make a fool out of themselves, you might say. Some of the difficulties. You know, the first thing was what kept us going. You shoot down. You would not know what a few little words would say when someone would say, the war can't last 3 more months. We'll be out of here before Christmas. You might say that was our cry, you might say. Just to hear those words from somebody who was just shot down was just kept your heart beating. I chose a 3-day stay. Yesterday I was shot down, today's today, and tomorrow I'm going home. So I didn't have as hard to work for just maintain my sanity one day at a time. But those words were very important to our daily survival. One of the difficulties in early '66, Robert McNamara, then Secretary of Defense, took to the airways and declared the prisoners of war expendable. You know, in our warped sense of humor, being that only about 62 of us at that time, we just let it be. But it didn't sit well with our families. Could you imagine the leader of our nation, the head man of the war, telling a father or mother that their son was expendable? Telling a wife her husband is expendable? Telling their child that their daddy was expendable. Our families went in arms over this. And as McNamara is capable of doing, he tried to smooth it over, and he said what he was trying to do was try to get the pressure off for us and make us of no value. Of course, when you label someone as not valuable, then possibility you could be killed because of that. But anyway, he achieved his goal. Not only did we get removed from the front pages of the newspaper, we were delegated to the back pages, and in a short period of time, we didn't make the paper at all. And these were the results of the way they handled the situation. Shortly thereafter, I moved out to the Bry Patch, which was much like the Son Tay that some of us have talked about here today. And no running water, no electricity, in a small cell that was 5 feet by 8 feet in solitary confinement. They fed us early in the morning and late in the afternoon, and they hogtied us during the day. And they said that for our safety, they said. And so we spent nearly a year being hogtied. During that period of time, that we had what we referred to as a Hanoi March, and some of you remember that. They took a group of prisoners of war and dressed them in their fancy duds and handcuffed them together and paraded them through the streets of Hanoi as what they had accomplished. And it backfired on them, and they got condemnation from the rest of the world for parading prisoners of war through a street like a cattle drive in West Texas, as the Vietnamese beat on Americans as they were being taken down the streets. Ho Chi Minh never apologized for that, but he did come back and say that if we asked for forgiveness, because he had said that all of us would be tried when the war was over, but he did soften them and said if we would ask for forgiveness, he would forgive us and we would be allowed to return home when the war was over. So the first thing they did is they came into the prison camp. They wanted us to choose one of two ways, that of the war-mongering Johnson administration or the peace-loving Americans. And we refused to choose. They beat the living hell out of us because we wouldn't make a choice. And so after that was over, then they came in and over again. And this time, lo and behold, we all made the wrong choice. So we went through torture again over a period of about 6 months. Many of us being beaten nearly half to death. They eventually forced us to write some sort of apology to the Vietnamese government. You know, our leaders understood the difficulties we were in. The only thing they added to the code of conduct was not to sustain permanent injury. Know when to say when. Don't give up the ship. In other words, many of us knew a lot of things, and we had to manage what we gave them so that we wouldn't give up something. We would not take torture until we lost control. And that was the rules that they wanted us to live by. It's amazing how many different airplanes that Clark Kent flew in North Vietnam. We had, everybody would use a fictitious character like Clark Kent, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers. All of these guys were great pilots during the Vietnam War, you know. And so they did that, and so that if this stuff ever got released, the American people would know what a bogus thing it was. In fact, one of these confessions were read at the Lord Brussells Tribunal in Brussels. An American journalist gave his brother up. Because Neil Tanner from Western Tennessee had used Clark Kent in his statement. And an American journalist gave up a fellow American and told the Vietnamese that that was a bogus individual. As a result of that, Neil Tanner spent 22 months in leg irons, getting out 15 minutes a day for 22 months because our journalist was more interested in the Pulitzer Prize than he was in protecting an American soldier. Due to failing health, we were eventually moved back to what we now refer to as a zoo, which is part of a few miles from the Hanoi Hilton. Once we got back, we had different rules that we lived. And like I said, our basic thing was return with honor. We lived under the motto, never give up, never give in, roll with the punches, bounce back, and get ready for the next round. We did not question each other's motive or what he had to do to stay alive. We just encourage each other. The difficult part of torture is not what you went through because you feel like you can control that. When the guy next to you in the next cell, you can't help him. He's being hogtied. He's been tied up and his head pounded against the concrete floor, and you can do nothing for him but pray. These were the pains that we experienced. as we watch and listen to our brothers being beaten nearly to death. That's because we were Americans. When I think about heroes, I think about my brothers in South Vietnam. We're talking about different ones. We have a full accounting, you might say, of North Vietnam. There's probably 125 prisoners of war that died during captivity in North Vietnam from various reasons, from either the aircraft crash or being beat to death by the Vietnamese. But we have no accounting whatsoever of South Vietnam. We do not know how many were killed on the spot or were captured and was killed later. We have no true accounting of our losses in South Vietnam. We know of many escapes, and but we know that some escaped, but they were recaptured and essentially executed by the Vietnamese. But when you think about heroes, there's many sitting here in this audience. These were the families. These are the ones that kept the light burning at home. You know, the wives who stood there, they got up every morning, put their smiley face on, looked at their kids and said, everything's going to be all right. Daddy's fine. He'll be home soon. And then they would, after the kids were leaving for school, they put their head in their hands and weep, thinking, have I lied to my children? What am I going to do if things change? How am I going to handle it? These are the heroes. I was single, but my sisters kept me alive in the eyes of their children. When I got home, they remembered more about me than I remembered, because I was a bigger-than-life figure to them. And, you know, I was very grateful for my family staying strong. My dad and my stepmother put a light in the corner of the room. That light burned for over 8 years before it went out. They never changed that light bulb the whole time I was gone. Once we got back from the Biocrats, up to that point, most of us had spent anywhere from 6 months to 8 months in solitary confinement, and there were some that eventually would spend over 4 years in solitary confinement. They started putting us together because they'd run out of room. Well, again, the Vietnamese were the same way. They didn't think it was going to be a long war, so they didn't want to spend the money to build a prison camp, and they didn't want to comply with Geneva Convention or anything like that existed. And in fact, the International Red Cross, which governs the Geneva Convention, when the Vietnamese would not honor, they said, they're not prisoners of war, they're criminals, and so therefore they will not be afforded that prisoner of war status. The American Red Cross did send us parcels, but unfortunately, when they were found on dead North Vietnamese soldiers in South Vietnam, they quit sending packages. And so essentially, letters and packages and everything were almost non-existent at a certain point. And President Johnson took the airways on March the 29th, 1968, announced to the world that he was going to step down and dedicate his efforts to bringing an honorable end to the Vietnam War. But it turned out just to be a ploy to get old Humpty Dumpty elected. He had no goal whatsoever to end the war. The saddest part, during the Johnson administration, not a single prisoner of war or representative was ever invited to the White House to represent the families of the prisoners of war in both North and South Vietnam. When he stopped the bombing, there was no more 3 more months the war would be over when we were going home. We were abandoned for 3 years. We had no outside information. One good thing out of it, the food did improve a little bit, and packages started coming from our families. There were few and far between. Some people will never know why they received the package and others did not. Letters were the same way. And if I harbor any ill feelings toward the Vietnamese, it's not how I was treated, but the way the families were treated. Some guys their families did not find out until a week before they were released that their son, their father, their husband was coming home. I was listed and missing in action for 3.5 years before they owned up to the fact that I was a prisoner of war. These packages came in, and the way we found out that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Some of you remember years ago in all the condiments on the table in a restaurant, you could flip over the sugar pack, and there was a little bit of American history on the back. And one of those sugar packs was in a package that came into North Vietnam showing Neil Armstrong planting the American flag on the moon in 1969. And that's how we found out that we had made that accomplishment. We could read between the lines, but we still didn't hide anything. And we upset the Vietnamese when we all went out one day and our senior ranking officer called the group to attention and we all saluted the moon. And the Vietnamese could not figure out why we were saluting the moon. And we told them, right now, there's an American flag on the moon. And they spent days trying to figure out how in the hell we knew there was a flag on the moon. In one of the packages that I received, there were some pictures. And of course, they were always, they didn't understand English well, and we didn't understand Vietnamese at all, but they were always looking at the expressions. And as I was explaining each one of these photos, I got to someone I didn't know, and all of a sudden I just had a new second cousin, and I gave her life and history and everything else, and I got to keep these pictures. And when I went back to the room and I shared them with my roommates at that time, and I said, I don't have a clue who this is. And so someone said, that's so-and-so's wife and kids. And that was a shot in the arm for all of us that our families were now together. That my family had met his family, and they were, you might say, they were praying together, playing together, and crying together as they waited for their loved ones to come home. I was in, last week I spoke Friday and Monday in Jefferson City and in Danridge, and one of their favorite sons was one of my jailmates, General Norm Gaddis. He had moved to Seymour Johnson before, and his wife Hazel stayed in that area, and she was the coordinator for all the wives and families in North Carolina. And so she was the one that was responsible for the ones that had the opportunity to receive packages to make sure that I had fit the picture of Jim. And I know that if I'd have walked up to Jim with $1 million in one hand and those 2 photos of his wife and 2 kids, we all know which one Jim would have taken. And that's the closeness we had together. We lived in what we referred to as our faith. We had 4 of them. Faith in ourselves, that we had the tools to get the job done. Faith in each other, that we would stand shoulder to shoulder and eventually someday we would return home with honor. Faith in our country, that it would not abandon us under difficult circumstances. But most of all, faith in our God, He would see us through. The morale factor after the election, President Nixon was taking the oath of office, and the next day, the Vietnamese were digging foxholes. We knew that something had been said, and they believed it. As a result of that, our morale went sky high. President Nixon, whether you like him or don't, he invited the POW families and representatives to Washington, told them all that he knew about their loved ones. To gain the respect of a few families who had been abandoned by the previous administration. And he assured our families when the time came, he would bring us all home. It brings us part of some of us have talked about today and talked about the Son Tay Raid. A group of our military had briefed President Nixon and said there's a prison camp called Son Tay, 40 miles outside of Hanoi. We know there's between 40 and 60 Americans being held there. And we believe we have the firepower, the willpower, and all that's needed, and we can go in and bring our brothers home. And so they set up a mock prison camp down at Eglin Air Force Base, and they trained until they were ready. You know, Bull Simon, Dick Meadows, they handpicked a crew. The reason they had to handpick them, they had so many volunteers, they had to turn away people that all they wanted to do is bring their brothers home. We quit flying reconnaissance missions over the area so as not to bring any attention to it. And on the 20th of November, 1970, they executed a flawless mission. The whole plan was to bring a helicopter in, make a hard landing, extract the people out of the helicopter. They would start securing the area, and one group would blow a hole in the wall and bring in reinforcements, and they'd start looking for prisoners of war. They were brokenhearted. They thought what a failure they had been when they could not find any prisoners of war. They wept, thinking what a failure they had been. And even some of our leadership referred to it as a failure. But as a result of that action, the Vietnamese changed the label of expendable to high value. The Hanoi Hilton that we were only using about 15% of, all of a sudden, they come in and whitewashed the whole place, moved out the political prisoners that had a female prison inside. I mean, it's a huge complex. And all of a sudden, guys that had been in solitary confinement for over 4 years, all of a sudden walked into a room, and they had 40 roommates. This is what a small group of dedicated Army, Navy, and Air Force, Marine Corps did for us. Each one had a particular mission. The Army led the way with the Air Force as the bus drivers, you might say. We furnished the transportation because we had faster helicopters than the Army did at that particular time and could carry more. But that's what we do for each other. Once we moved in, reality was there was probably anywhere from 40 to 60 guys that would never survive in another 2 years under the conditions we were living under. But they got to come home and live out their life with their loved ones because of a few dedicated men who believed in the mission. I saw my military at its finest. When the Vietnamese came into that room of 40 plus individuals and said, "You're in charge," The senior ranking officer stood up and said, "No, I'm in charge." In some rooms, it went 5 and 6 deep. Each time, the next senior ranking officer stood up. And we won our first major victory with the Vietnamese. A lot of things had happened up to that point. Ho Chi Minh had died, and they were really, I think they were just like us, looking for an end to the war. And as a result of that, our seniors could plead for medical assistance and anything we needed to make sure that we all had the opportunity to come home. I remember during that period of time, a friend of mine from southern Alabama, come from humble beginnings, and he talked about this American flag. He said, "You know, all my life we have had a flag in my home to remind me of the country that I love." And Mike set out to make the first flag that was ever flown in North Vietnam. He took simple materials, anything he could gather from button to simple piece of clay pebble, anything he could take and attach. And in the back of that long sleeve shirt, he took string from the blanket that was given to him. He took a bamboo stick and sharpened it into a needle and carefully put every stitch in there, building the first American flag using cigarette ashes and clay tile from the roof to make the colors he wanted to give the stars and bars and stripes of our flag. Senator McCain was in the room when Mike unfurled the flag. He was in the room next to us. And he described the moment as these guys, we think of them as old, but most of them were in their 30s. They'd been to hell and back. But when they saw that flag, they stood up proudly and recited the Pledge of Allegiance together. That's who we were. Mike secured that flag during the day, and then at night he would display it in the room. And unfortunately, the Vietnamese pulled a surprise inspection and they found that flag and they went ballistic. Mike, being the person he was, went charging to the front of the room, identifying himself as the maker of the flag. And as a result of that, he took a rock butt across the back of the head and fell feet first in front of his roommates. As they moved forward to help Mike, the Vietnamese locked and loaded and grabbed Mike and drug him out of the room feet first. We could hear Mike as he was screaming with pain as he was beaten. Not for military information, not even propaganda, just because he wanted to share an American flag with his brothers. Eventually, Mike was brought back, just like he left, feet first, semi-unconscious. McCain tells the story that they weren't sure Mike would survive the beating he had taken. But with cold water, washcloth, and prayer, Mike eventually recovered. Eventually, one day, with a grin from ear to ear, Mike sat up in the middle of his bed and announced to the roommates, "Time for flag number 2. You never give up, you never give in, you roll with the punches, you bounce back, you get ready for the next round." Someone asked me one time, is there a short version of POW life? And I could easily say there's minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, yes, even years of boredom punctuated by terror. President Nixon, when he took office, he was devastated for what he had learned. The Vietnamese were not even fighting their own war. And we were fighting the war with our allies, standing shoulder to shoulder. President Johnson was told that the Vietnamese are shooting us in the back. His solution was take their bullets away from them and put the full brunt of the war on the American soldier and our allies. And with LBJ that stood up and said, I'm not going to send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. And within 2 years, he had over 600,000 combat troops in Southeast Asia fighting the war that we were never supposed to fight. President Nixon understood, and when he got there, all he had was a army on paper. They did not have anybody that we could turn the war over to. President Nixon spent the next couple of years rebuilding the Vietnamese army, and as they stood up, we stood down. And eventually reached the point where the Vietnamese were able to fight their war with our assistance. They had the manpower, the willpower, they had the airplanes, they had everything needed. In fact, we were still training helicopter pilots at Shepherd Air Force Base in 1974 till we're going back to Vietnam. And President Nixon, essentially in December 1972, we had accomplished our mission. We were prepared to turn the war back over to the Vietnamese. The only thing left was the prisoners of war. All the other things had been signed by the Vietnamese, and when discussion of the prisoners of war was brought up, the Vietnamese said, just go in the house, we'll take care of that later. President Nixon said, no, we'll take care of it now. We knew at that point there were French prisoners that had been captured in 1954 and been held prisoner of war and were not released until 1979. And he was not going to allow, nor were the American people, or nor were the American soldier, sailor, airman, marine, or coast guardman would allow their brothers to be left behind. And so he had the whole country behind him when he approved what was referred to as Linebacker 2 in December 1972. In an 11-day period, taking 1 day off for Christmas, we dropped more bombs than ever been dropped in the history of mankind. Not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms of some 500 plus Americans being held in cages and cells in North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. As a result of that bombing, the Vietnamese came back to the table. And on the 26th of January, 1973, that statement was read from the White House lawn and in the prison camps in North Vietnam to each and every prisoner that the war was over, that we had reached an agreement on the 12th of February would start the release of the prisoners of war and the release of all the combat soldiers in South Vietnam would be returning home with the completion date of 29 March 1973. I always say that was the longest moments in my life as I came home first and had to wait for my brothers to come home. We were hounded by the press wanting our story. They didn't give a damn about the ones that were behind me waiting to be released. They were more interested in their purified or haven't I got you statement. And we told them to come back to see us on the 29th of March when the last wheels are up, and we'll talk. But we're not going to do anything to jeopardize the release of those we had to leave behind. When we didn't arrive on the 12th of February, I had the pleasure of celebrating Valentine's Day on my journey back home. I celebrated Valentine's Day in the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, San Francisco, all in 1 day, eventually arriving home. During that period of time, a friend of mine was asked, could you define freedom? And he simply said, doors with inside knobs. Make it an opportunity that we each have, our kids have, our parents, everyone has an opportunity when they can open a door and walk through and enjoy the adventures on the other side. I lost that knob for 2,703 days. We went to different hospitals. We were treated like royalty. We got to parade and the speeches that belong to all of you here. I can't imagine how you felt after you served your country with honor. You came on American soil. Not only did they time it so you came in the middle of the night, there was somebody there from the State Department ordering you to take off your uniform as not to offend anyone. I can't imagine my country doing that to those who love this country so much. I got your welcome, and I'll never forget who made it possible for me to come home. To me, as I look back on my some 80 plus years on this great earth, I'll always say the saddest moment to me is when we forgave those who ran before we as a nation stood up and said thank you to those who served. Even the horrible parts, thank you. Thank you. The hardest part is the fact that, yes, we sent a few cowards to Canada, but they sent us 5 times as many brave men that stood shoulder to shoulder with us as a nation. In terms of losses, we had over 300,000 permanent injured. We, Vietnam veterans, lost more limbs than all the rest of the wars combined. As I mentioned before, 58,000, over 1,500 are still missing in action. Over 20,000 kids grew up without a father. Me personally, only 1 out of 5 aircrew members shot down over Southeast Asia survived. So I can truly say I'm one of the luckiest men alive. The sad part about our generation, we could not separate the word war from warrior. So if the war was bad, the warrior was bad. And it was backed up by Walter Cronkite. He describes the Tet Offensive as we killed, wounded, and captured nearly 45,000 North Vietnamese. We lost 100 brave men, and he called that a defeat for America. And LBJ said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war. In 1991, when our brothers and sisters, our nieces and nephews, our sons and daughters, and the neighbor's kid down the street, they went off to fight another war. Guess who reared their head again? It was the Kennedys, the Fonders, and the Carries that took to the airways to criticize our young men and women in uniform. And it was with the Vietnam veterans who stood up and said, hell no, not again. As a result of the actions of our veterans, we have been able to separate those 2 words, war and warrior. It's not how you feel about a war, that's your feeling. But how you feel about our warriors, that's our responsibility to make sure that one generation of veterans are never, never abandoned by another. In closing, I want to share with you the words of a friend of mine who's long since passed. But he said, during my years of captivity, one idea has dominated my thinking: how fortunate I am to be an American. I have seen the other side. I have had every real and imaginative thought of the United States of America pointed out to me time and time again by my captors. But I have returned with a strong conviction, although we are far from perfect, our system excels all others on earth, and our basic ideas and principles are honorable and just. I can't help but think about Dave standing there, and he read this last paragraph. He was looking into the young eyes of our young warriors who have raised their right hand and said, "Take me, I want to defend America." When he expressed the confidence in them to get the job done, when he said, "I have faith that we will continue to work for a peaceful world and freedom while firmly resisting those who enslave mankind." That's the burden we place on our young people, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard. They are the ones in the Space Force. They are standing on the front lines, and God knows where, for the freedoms that we enjoy every day. It was Ronald Reagan who said, "Some people spend an entire lifetime wondering if they made a difference." Our armed forces doesn't have that problem. An old friend of mine from Kodiak, Tennessee, just down the road from here, he gave me a bumper sticker that I proudly display in my room, and it simply says, "Only two defining forces ever offered to die for you: Jesus Christ and the American soldier. One for your soul and the other for your freedom." You know, in this great land of ours, some people dream the dream. Some people live the dream. Our armed forces, you defend that dream. God bless the defenders of the dream. Thank you.